Thank you for coming. My name is Adrien Segal. I'm an artist. I live in San Francisco, California. And I'm going to talk today about my artwork, also some of my in-depth process, a lot of the research that informs my work, as well as some bigger ideas about science, the scientific lens, and how we study the natural environment, and things like history, landscape, and natural phenomena. So usually my work starts with a very personal experience in reality in the natural landscape. This is a site off the coast of California called the Sutro Bathhouses. And I had a very personal experience in this landscape where I visited this site. Ruins are very, you don't see too many ruins in America, so straight off, this site is very unique. In addition, the history of the site is quite interesting. It used to be a bathhouse. In 1896, when it was built, it was the world's largest swimming pool. There were a series of 7 pools, and the ocean tides were recirculating. 7 of the pools were salt pools, and it was used recreationally. So what struck me about this site is both that it's leftover, it was once used to harness the ocean tides, and now those same ocean tides, which is this great natural phenomena of force, are slowly taking those tides back, and it will eventually return to the ocean. So that experience leads to a process of inquiry and wondering about how we study these greater natural forces that are all around us. When you do a quick search, at least in America, you find a resource like this. This is the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration's website. They keep all historic tide databases, and they make it openly accessible to anyone who searches. And the San Francisco Tide Station is the longest continually operating station. It was set up in 1854, and you can access the data going all the way back to that date. When you reduce something like the tides down to the quantification or the measurement, it looks like this. This is literally a data table showing you the date, the time, and the measurement for a full 24-hour period of tides. So that's every 6 minutes they take a measurement of where the water level is at. This is then visualized into a graph. This is also by the NOAA. Here you can see both the predicted and the verified water level. So the tides are caused by a combined influence of the moon and the sun's gravity on the earth and its ocean. So it's actually a 29.5-day cycle that repeats. I sourced 29 days of tide charts, layered them on top of each other, and came up with this 2-dimensional graphic. And this is the point at which, in a project, I've realized that I've found something that could be turned into a bigger project, that there's something to be revealed that can't be seen in a single moment. My design process then leads through, sorry, this is like playing on its own, through a series of iterations, a lot of sketching to figure out proportion, scale to the body is really important to me. I have a background in furniture design, so that's also considering the materials that I could make this thing out of, how I might fabricate those shapes and forms. And in this case, I decided to use flat bar steel to create each of those graphs. So you can see here's some of the process. I hand bent those, and then this is the finished piece. So in the creation of the object, I'm considering not only the data, but also how it's then made accessible to the body, and also the light and the shadows and the actual form that it takes. I'm also considering how the information might still be read even though I've removed all of the numbers and all of the analytic information behind it. Someone who has a fundamental understanding or experience of looking at these charts can know without being told that these are tide charts. And other people can usually tell because I title the work based on the data that I use. So this piece is titled Title Datum San Francisco. I've made 3 versions based on different data from different sites. I grew up in the West in Colorado, which is a very arid landscape. The image on the left is of what used to be the Colorado River where it hit the ocean. It hasn't actually run all the way to the ocean in about 50 years because we use all of the water before it gets there. Learning about these facts makes me wonder what we're using all of the water for, and that will lead to inquiry. The Colorado River is one of the most litigated rivers in the world. Over 40 million people rely on it for their survival, including cities like Phoenix, Las Vegas, San Diego, Tijuana. So that inquiry then will lead me to the research again. This is a chart that is another government agency that collected the entire water consumption statistics for all of the United States from 1950. This one goes until the year 2000. You can see in the center, that's a bar chart. So it's split up into 8 different categories. Things like public supply, industrial uses, livestock, mining, agriculture. You can see that the 2 greatest uses, the green area is irrigation, and this yellow area at the bottom is what really struck me about that chart. That's referring to thermoelectric power. So just under half of all of the water in the United States goes to energy, producing energy. In having an understanding of what the data might turn into, I like to choose forms that reflect and intuitively communicate the ideas that I'm talking about, in this case, arid landscapes and the lack of water. So some of the sketching ends up looking like this. And then the fabrication process in this case, I ended up cutting layers of plywood to create that negative form, and then carved it all back using hand tools. So these are some of the tools I use. It's a very full body experience. I love this part of the process because it's so much energy and time to figure out exactly what I want to make and feel confident that it is going to be the effect of the thing that I want to make. And when I get into this step, it's very much a methodical, meditative part of the process. And I get to experience the data through the physical act of carving it. It also reflects those same processes that are carving the landscape through wind and water over a geologic scale. And I'm doing it just in my own individual mind and through my body. And then as the slides flip through, this is the finished piece. So in short, the data is driving the form. Time is the vertical scale. And the widths of those canyon walls are getting wider or narrower based on the categorical usage of water. The material reflects the landscape by which it was inspired. So sometimes I work directly with the researchers who collect the data. I found this really wonderful graphic. This is one map of a whole bunch of maps that were created of the Mississippi River as it meanders. It's a very large river in the eastern United States. It was created in 1944, and I brought this to some scientists at the Oregon Water Research Science Center and asked them if they had anything like it, and they said they didn't have anything like it, but they had this, which in my mind is very similar. So what I'm looking at here is that I know all rivers aren't the same, but I think the artifact that can come out of the process can give a portrait of a unique place. This is like on autoplay, sorry guys. So this is a LiDAR scan of a specific river in Oregon called the Malala River. They've scanned it every 5 years approximately, so this is the path that it took over that time, 15 years total. Similar to the last piece, this is some of the process of cutting those shapes and physically gluing them up, and then carving them back. And then this is the finished piece. So you can see in this view, there was a flood in the river between 2005 and 2009 that caused an extra arm to form. And what I really find so compelling about making a static representation of data, especially about a natural process, is that if you're standing next to a river, you can only see it at one given moment. And perhaps if you live next to it, you can see it as it changes over time. But when you create a static representation that shows you that shape over time, it allows you to see it in a different way. This next piece was a commission I did that was related to the really complex system of water rights that we have in California. It was basically established during the mining era, and because water is such a valuable resource there, it's a very complex system that I won't get too far into, but this is essentially a data sculpture that is made out of aluminum and ball chain. It's roughly in the shape of a river, and each ball chain represents one water user. So everyone who uses the large amounts of water is permitted. It's permitted what they can use that for and for how much they can use every year. So each chain is one user, and then the color of the chain indicates if it's the state government, the corporation, an individual, etc. This is a very large piece. It's a large atrium in an office building, and you can see here that the chains were organized in a particular way where the greatest users all actually ended up hitting the floor in one place, so you can see it in this video view. It was very hard to document because of all of the office around it. And then this is a view from the bottom floor looking up. So it spans 3 floors. The client let me do pretty much whatever I wanted to do, which was fantastic. Very unusual. So I also look a lot at drought and the lack of water. Particularly wildfires are a really big problem and continuing to get to be a bigger issue in California. In combination with long-term control of wildfires, we've been putting out wildfires since about 1910. There was a really bad fire near Chicago. And ever since then, there have been regulations that we put out every single wildfire that occurs. And what happens is that the forest doesn't have its natural burn cycle, and the fires get much more intense and much worse. So what we look at now, because of that human intervention, is we get really bad fires, and they continually get worse every year. This is actually a series of fires. It was just last year, I think it was this exact same time last year. It began as a dozen fires, you can see from a satellite here, and it's the most destructive fire in California history. I'll tell you what that means in a second. So the series of fires all combined, they believe it started from a downed power line, and it was incredibly destructive. The city of Santa Rosa lost 2,800 homes, 22 people were killed. It hit in the middle of the night, around 1:30 in the morning, so a lot of people just didn't have time to get out of the way. And typically, we measure fires by 3 metrics. That is the area burned, the number of lives lost, and the cost of the destruction. So this particular fire was $1.3 billion US. Sorry about that. Additionally, taxpayer dollars, usually around $3 billion a year, are spent just on fighting wildfires. So it's a big problem, getting worse. This is how we measure fires. This is called a fire progression map. So you can see that's the perimeter of the burned area with a timestamp as it progresses. This particular fire is both the 3rd largest and the 3rd most destructive in California. A lost hunter was somewhere in the wilderness and decided to start it to signal people who were looking for him so that he could be found. So when you take that same progression map and you turn time into one of the dimensions, you can see that fire in a much different way. You can see how it moved over time. You can see that at the bottom where it started, it was growing one direction, and then it switched and ended up going a totally different direction. So my inquiry is to ask if something that's so destructive might also be beautiful, and it invites us to reconsider that perhaps a fire is a necessary part of nature and not just something that destroys human lives. This next project I began when I did an artist residency in Homer, Alaska, I think about 3 years ago, so that's me collecting water in front of a glacier. So glaciers are kind of this iconic representation of climate change, but they're also so far away. We're so far removed from what it actually means when you see images like this of 100 years ago it looked like that, and now it's totally different. Unfortunately, the data about the retreat of glaciers is mostly limited to aerial or satellite imagery, usually only goes back about 30 years. And it's not really about mass or how much water has been lost. It's usually just showing how far they've receded on a map. When I was there, I met with a researcher who was studying glacial retreat, and he provided a bunch of maps, including this one, which is called Gruint Glacier. It's the one I showed of the photo of me collecting water. So there's an observed terminal moraine from the 1800s. In total, it's about 150 years of data. Oops. I used a CAD program in this case, again, using time to capture the form as it's changed over time, and to create a shape that represents exactly the mass that's lost. It's not a scientific measurement, but it gives the effect of how that shape has receded. And in this case, I carved the form in plywood, but that wasn't where I wanted to end, because not everything needs to be plywood, and two, we're talking about the ephemeral loss of ice as it melts. And I wanted the sculpture to be a more ephemeral representation of that, because the idea must drive the material choices that I use as well as the final outcome. So I went through the mold making process, did a cast version of this, and it exists as a video documentation. So I want to take a step back for a second just to talk about some bigger ideas that are happening and some of the underlying reasons and why I use data in my work. We live in what some call the age of information, and that sort of means that never before in history have humans been measuring and quantifying and collecting data to the degree that we are now. It also means that that information has never been as accessible due to the internet and things like self-quantification. I'm wondering if this means that the information boom can actually contribute to the advance of knowledge in society. So to understand that, it helps to look at the relationship between data, information, knowledge, and then to wisdom. Given context, data becomes information, and information giving meaning then becomes knowledge. In collecting data, I'm wondering if scientific inquiry is seeking to answer a specific question. Usually it is. The scientific methodology is founded on the basis of objectivity. That is, the conventional belief is that in order to uncover truths about the natural world, we must systematically eliminate all personal biases and all emotional involvement as we pursue pure objectivity. The problem with that is that objectivity is not static. The idea of objectivity is fluid. It changes throughout time, and it's a cultural practice. It's taken on different human morals, meanings, and practices throughout history. So this is an example of idealized nature and mechanical objectivity. These shifts are due to aesthetic taste, technology, and ways of communicating. There may be consequences that come from trying to remove all emotional involvement with scientific study. You can see in these two examples that in fact scientists do have emotional responses to their research, but we don't ever really hear about it except for in small cases like that. And this is something you've been hearing in several, or at least I've heard in several other presentations at this conference, that the role of the artist is to ask questions rather than to answer them. So science can tell you how to clone a Tyrannosaurus Rex, and humanities can tell you why this might be a bad idea. The world doesn't make sense, so why should I paint pictures that do? This doesn't mean that artists just make art for art's sake, per se. It's not nonsensical. This is a great quote from Albert Camus. "Art for art's sake is not understandable to the masses, or else in no way expresses the truth. Art cannot be a monologue." When we tend to think of art objects, this is from John Dewey, who wrote a wonderful book called Art as Expression. We tend to think of, well, when we think of art, we tend to think of art objects. John Dewey believes this is a mistake. He believes that it's actually art is what connects both the maker and the encounterer in an experience. Therefore, a work of art is a refined form of experience. This is another quote that backs that up. So we should stop thinking about artworks as objects and start thinking about them as triggers for experience. Hopefully it can help bring us out of this mess of information that we're trying to figure out. Objects are not necessarily the most interesting part about art. It is what the object does to me when I look at it or engage with it that it is interesting. You are somehow provoked into a more negotiating role. What am I looking at? What does looking actually mean? Why am I seeing things the way I am seeing it? Instead of questioning the object, you are in fact questioning yourself. So art can offer an opportunity for self-evaluation. That's a quote by Olafur Eliasson that I quite like. And the last project I'm going to talk to you about is one that I've done most recently called Wheat Mandalas. It's a series, and it began in 2016. It was a partnership between the Data Physicalization Lab at the University of Lethbridge in Canada, who invited 6 artists to participate in a project that had them looking at agricultural data. So that included a visit to go meet the scientists directly and have a direct connection to them in their research. They presented what they were working on while we were there. And this is some of the data, an example of the data that I was provided. Most of it was genetic code. Most of it was related to Puccina stratiformis, which is called latently wheat rust, and it's a plant pathogen. It's specifically a fungus that causes stripe rust on wheat. It can be very devastating, and it can wipe out an entire crop, has the potential to cause significant famine. This is a hand-carved model of a spore of wheat rust fungus. And then this is a map that shows how it's been tracked as it's moved around the world and developed different, more virulent strains. One of the scientists is doing research about genetic modification as a way to develop a strain of wheat that will be resistant to wheat rust. So this is a scan of the RNA, that some of the data that was directly provided to me. And then this is the genetic modification method that he would use called CRISPR. So they'll identify a trait that are resistant to the pathogen within the genetic code, manipulate the code by taking that code from the donor DNA, snipping it, and then placing it in there. This data was incredibly challenging for me to work with. It was so far removed from the tangible reality of life that I was struggling to turn it into something meaningful. Along with the gene, the bit and the atom are examples of how science relies on the complete reduction and control of nature in order to study it. So this leads me on a path of intense research and industry and wondering, how did we get to the place where we want to genetically modify wheat to be able to have a future? And wheat has an incredibly long history throughout culture. It's been cultivated for about 10,000 years, probably longer. In Roman times, they used to have agricultural festivals in which there were sacrifices and other events that were worshiping this specific god, Robigus, as a way to rely on divine intervention to prevent agricultural disease. This is an example of a poster from America. There was an educational campaign and a large-scale plant disease control program. It's from 1918. when wheat rust was first brought to America, and it was actually a pretty successful campaign. And then this is, more or less the microscopic view of a wheat cell. Sorry about that. So I have a fascination with this enormous cultural shift from relying on the divine to help us with agricultural disease to now the scientific study of genetic code and the manipulation of that code. They're both practices that share the same goal, to prevent agricultural disease. This brings me to The Varieties of Religious Experience by a philosopher named William James. This was published in 1902. Our own more rational beliefs are based on evidence exactly similar in nature to that which mystics quote for theirs. Our senses have assured us of certain states of fact, but mystical experiences are as direct perceptions of fact for those who have them as any sensations ever were for us. And he was also influenced by Leo Tolstoy. Besides rational knowledge, which had seemed to me the only knowledge, I was inevitably brought to acknowledge that all live humanity has another irrational knowledge of faith, which makes it possible to live. So I think both of those characters were grappling with this divide between scientific research and what it means to be human and to have a belief. Thinking on the mystical and the irrational and the sacred brought me to the form of the mandala. Some believe that mandalas are mental maps of alternate universes which can be entered by meditation. The mandala is an emanation of an alternate universe into our daily lives. It is also a portal from that universe into the other, a map for finding one's way in the alternate universe, and a path back to our daily lives. So you can see here I've created a design that incorporates a lot of the historical research as a way to help me stabilize, integrate, and reorder that daily life. And this is the mandala of that single form, mainly focusing on wheat rust research. The reason so much of this research is happening about wheat rust is we're worried about how to feed the world by 2050. So the idea is that technology can save us, that agriculture must produce more. We're expected to have over 9 billion people to feed. And I wonder if technology is the answer, then what was the question? This is a quote I quite like by Cedric Price, who is a very experimental architect from England. So what does 9 billion people mean for this planet? And would increasing food production actually solve the problem of feeding 9 billion people? In fact, there's plenty of food in the world right now, but there's still a lot of malnutrition out in the world, and it's not because we're not producing enough. So the adequate food supply does not guarantee that all people have enough to eat and that hunger will be eliminated. These are some of the metrics that the Food and Agriculture Organization uses to determine food security. Availability is one issue, but physical and economic access, vulnerability, and shocks, such as political stability and violence, are big issues. And I'm just gonna say there's some really graphic imagery coming up related to famine. So this second mandala ended up focusing on the history of famine and historic examples of when that has happened throughout history, because I think we need to rely on history to understand what's happening in the future, how we can make better decisions about the future. So there was a mass famine in the Soviet Union in 1929 to 1930, mainly in Ukraine. It was part of a plan that Stalin had to industrialize the Soviet Union. They started food requisitioning. They were trying to increase grain imports despite the fact that many people were starving within the country. Not sure what's going on here. In 1932, food theft was made punishable by death or 10 years imprisonment, and the result was that over 10 million people starved. 16 countries officially considered this a genocide, intentional. In 1934, the Soviet Union was still brought into the League of Nations. There was a mass campaign to not allow that information to leave the country. So Politically, the Soviet state's position reflected both Soviet propaganda and the work of some Western journalists that didn't allow that information to get to the public. This is a wonderful philosopher I quite like that applies to this situation. A free press and an active political opposition constitute the best early warning system a country threatened by famines can have. In this case, there was no free press. A similar thing happened in China. In 1958 through 1962, the campaign was led by Chairman Mao Zedong. Industrialization and collectivization as well. These are some of the images that came from that, both propaganda of how much wheat there was and the reality of people not having enough to eat to a very extensive degree. And they don't know exactly how many people died, but it was in the tens of millions. So who today has the greatest threat of famine? And this is a gravestone historically from Yemen of a woman holding wheat, which was a symbol of fertility. And today, Yemen is where it's really bad. Up to 6 million people are potentially on the brink of starvation. I read 1.9 million children. This is from this last week. This girl has since passed away. This is what I woke up to in my news feed this morning. It's really a sad situation. And who's to blame? Saudi Arabia has blockaded humanitarian aid from reaching ports. There's a war going on. Saudi Arabia is bombing Yemen. They blame that Houthis taking over are causing the problem. And in the meantime, the United States and Britain are selling arms at very extensive amounts to Saudi Arabia. So there's a bit of a conflict of interest here. This is Trump signing a $110 billion arms deal last year in May. He said it was a tremendous day. This is the national symbol of Yemen, and this is one of their largest mosques called the People's Mosque. It's in the capital. And then this is the mandala that I've created to try and make sense of the craziness of the situation, looking at famine today in the world. There's a detail. In various spiritual traditions, mandalas may be employed for focusing attention as a spiritual guidance tool for establishing a sacred space and as an aid to meditation. And I'm going to end that with an inspirational quote: "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." This is Martin Luther King, a civil rights activist from the US. And to end on a more positive story, this piece, the third mandala from the series, is called Year Without a Summer, and it begins with the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora, which was the largest observed volcanic eruption in recorded history. It was in modern-day Indonesia. The eruption was heard 2,600 kilometers away and ejected an estimated 10 billion tons of material into the stratosphere. This, in turn, spread all over through the stratosphere, lowered the global temperatures about 0.5 degree to 0.7 degrees Celsius, leading to a worldwide harvest failure and major food shortages across the northern hemisphere. So here is a temperature anomaly map of Europe for the following summer. This is why it's called the Year Without a Summer. It was freezing. There was snow in June, that kind of thing. Because horses were the main form of transportation at the time, this led to some interesting inventions. First, the lack of oats to feed horses inspired a German inventor, Karl Dreiss, to research new methods of horseless transportation. The early form of the bicycle was invented because of that event. And additionally, this is Mary Shelley. She is an author. She was vacationing at Lake Geneva that summer, and because it was so rainy and crappy out, her and her colleagues decided to have a competition to see who could write the scariest story. And she was only 18 at the time, but she ended up writing Frankenstein as a result of that. Here's a detail of some of the imagery that's used in the mandala to tell that story as a visual narrative. So the world is not binary, it's not black and white. We can't determine whether something is good or whether something is bad. There's a lot more gray area in between. So something that is seemingly a terrible event, such as this eruption, can also lead to some very beautiful things occurring culturally and otherwise. Here's the 3 pieces installed in the gallery in Canada earlier this year, and then the digital image of the 3 together. And I'm going to finish with a quote that inspired the title of the talk. Reason's last step is the recognition that there are an infinite number of things which are beyond it. This is by a French mathematician and scientist. He invented one of the earliest calculators. And I hope that somehow you might be inspired to think about things a little bit differently in terms of what we can see beyond the scientific lens. Thank you. Yeah.